You have exactly 24 hours to remove those noisemakers, or we're filing a lien against your property," Patricia Whitmore announced, her perfectly manicured finger jabbing toward the modest wind chimes hanging from David Chen's porch. The HOA president stood flanked by 2 board members, their clipboards raised like weapons, sunglasses reflecting the morning light with military precision. David stepped barefoot onto his doormat, coffee mug still warm in his hands, trying to process how his Tuesday morning had derailed into this confrontation. The Chimes' 3 simple bamboo tubes his late grandmother had given him swayed gently in the breeze, their whispered melody barely audible over the distant hum of traffic. "Patricia, these have been hanging here for 8 months. The guidelines specifically state that decorative items under 12 inches are subject to community standards." She cut him off, her voice sharp enough to slice through the suburban morning quiet. "And the community has complained." Behind her, Margaret Holbrook from 47 Maple Lane nodded vigorously, though David noticed she couldn't quite meet his eyes. The third member, Robert Kensington, shuffled his feet and stared at his clipboard with the intensity of someone discovering fire. "Who complained?" David asked, though he already knew the answer would be a deflection. "That's confidential information," Patricia replied, her smile as genuine as plastic flowers. "But I can tell you that multiple residents have expressed concerns about the constant noise disruption." The irony wasn't lost on David. This was the same woman who had successfully lobbied for the installation of a decorative fountain in the community. Center courtyard, a fountain that gurgled and splashed 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The same woman who had dismissed his complaint about the Hendersons' late-night pool parties with a wave of her hand and a lecture about community spirit. But David Chen wasn't just any resident. What Patricia Whitmore didn't know, what she was about to discover in the most spectacular way possible, was that the quiet software engineer she was bullying owned the largest architectural acoustic firm on the West Coast. His company had designed sound systems for stadiums, concert halls, and luxury resorts. He understood sound the way other people understood breathing, and David Chen was about to teach the Willowbrook Estates, HOA, a lesson they'd never forget. What began as a petty dispute quickly spiraled into open warfare. Patricia, the HOA president, unleashed every bureaucratic weapon she could find, surprise property inspections, sending legal threats, and rallying the nosiest residents to her side. But beneath the veneer of official concern was something far more personal, a grudge against David that stretched back years, fueled by an old slight she had never let go. David tried to handle it the right way. He showed up to emergency HOA meetings, where Patricia took every chance to humiliate him in front of neighbors he'd once called friends. Bit by bit, the truth came out. The multiple complaints about his wind chimes, all fabricated. Patricia had submitted them herself under fake names. She was using her position to target him, obsessed with revenge for a past offense he barely remembered. The breaking point came when Patricia ordered the confiscation of his grandmother's bamboo wind chimes during a bogus compliance inspection. She claimed they were a nuisance and stashed them in her garage like trophies. What she didn't know was that those chimes were the last gift from the woman who raised David after his parents were killed in a car crash. David didn't retaliate with rage, but with strategy. He turned to his expertise, acoustic engineering. Slowly, methodically, he built his case, not just against Patricia, but against the entire system that let HOA leaders wield unchecked power. It became a chess match: grief and justice on one side, arrogance and control on the other. David's masterpiece wasn't immediate. It took months of careful planning, but when it arrived, it shook the entire neighborhood. He installed 2 towering bells on either side of Patricia's HOA legal sound installation, fully compliant, yet acoustically engineered to turn her nights into torment. Every vibration, every echo was calibrated to exploit the very rules she'd once used to harass others. She couldn't stop it, not without admitting to the very behavior she'd punished others for. But the bells were just the beginning. The real triumph came as neighbors uncovered the truth, how Patricia had lied, manipulated, and abused her power for years. One by one, they turned against her. Her reputation crumbled. So did her grip on the HOA in the end. The Willowbrook Estates community would never be the same, and neither would David Chen. The certified letter arrived on Thursday morning, stamped with the official seal of Willowbrook Estates, HOA, and marked urgent final notice. David opened it over his morning coffee, his grandmother's empty chair still positioned by the window, where she used to sit and listen to the wind chimes. "Dear Mr. Chen," the letter began. "Your continued non-compliance with HOA regulations regarding unauthorized decorative installations constitutes a violation of Section 4.7 of the Willowbrook Estates Community Guidelines." David read the legal jargon twice, his engineering mind parsing through the deliberately convoluted language. Patricia had escalated beyond simple threats. She was now claiming his wind chimes violated noise ordinances, property value standards, and somehow even community aesthetic harmony, a phrase that didn't appear anywhere in the actual HOA bylaws. The letter demanded immediate removal, threatened daily fines of $150, and included a form for voluntary compliance. That would require him to admit wrongdoing and promise never to install any decorative items without prior HOA approval. His phone buzzed with a text from his neighbor, Sarah Martinez. "David, I'm so sorry. Patricia cornered me at the grocery store and made me sign something about noise complaints. I tried to explain I never complained about anything, but she said it was just a formality. I feel terrible." 3 more texts followed from other neighbors, each apologizing for signatures they'd been manipulated into providing. Patricia had been busy, canvassing the neighborhood with a clipboard and a story about protecting everyone's property values from certain residents who think the rules don't apply to them. David walked to his front porch and stood beneath the wind chimes. They were silent now, barely a whisper in the still morning air. He thought about his grandmother's stories, how she'd hung identical chimes outside her window in the assisted living facility until the day she died. How she'd told him that the sound reminded her of his grandfather's voice, calling her name across the years. His phone rang. Patricia's name appeared on the screen. "Mr. Chen, I trust you received our letter." "I did. And I've also received several apologies from neighbors you tricked into signing fake complaints." A pause. "I'm not sure what you mean by tricked, but I can assure you that the HOA takes all resident concerns seriously. We've conducted a thorough investigation." "What investigation?" "You went door to door with a clipboard and lied to people about what they were signing." "I resent that accusation." Patricia's voice had shifted to the tone she used during HOA meetings, the one that made grown adults feel like scolded children. "The fact is, Mr. Chen, you seem to think the rules don't apply. To you, first, the unauthorized garden modifications, then the exterior paint color dispute, and now this. Some people in this community have noticed a pattern." David felt the familiar weight of being singled out, the subtle accusations that had followed. Him, since moving to Willowbrook Estates, the garden modifications had been replacing dead shrubs with identical plants. The paint color dispute had been touching up faded trim with the exact same approved color. But somehow, when David Chen did these things, they became violations, requiring board review. "What is this really about, Patricia?" "This is about maintaining the standards that make Willowbrook Estates a desirable place to live. Standards that protect everyone's property values, not just yours. And the fact that you've been targeting me specifically since I moved here, that's just coincidence." Another pause, longer this time. "Mr. Chen, I think you're being paranoid. The HOA doesn't target anyone. We enforce the rules fairly and consistently." Then, why haven't you cited the Hendersons for their pool parties? Why haven't you demanded removal of the Stevens oversized mailbox? Why haven't you? This conversation is over. You have until Sunday to remove those wind chimes, or we'll be forced to take legal action." The line went dead. David looked at his phone, then at the wind chimes, then at the house across the street where Patricia Whitmore lived, her perfectly manicured lawn, her approved exterior color scheme, her regulation-sized decorative plantings. Everything exactly as it should be. He'd been investigating Patricia herself, using the same methodical approach he applied to acoustic engineering problems that most residents never bothered to conduct. David had spent his lunch break on Wednesday digging through property transfers, permit applications, and municipal meeting minutes. What he found painted a disturbing picture of Patricia. Whitmore's true motivations, the Willowbrook Estates HOA, had been established in 1987. Her campaign platform had been protecting community values. Fairfield Gardens had gone through a demographic shift in the late 2010s. Young professionals, and immigrant families had begun moving in, bringing different cultural practices and architectural preferences. Patricia had been active in that HOA too, proposing increasingly restrictive rules about exterior decorations, landscaping choices, and cultural displays that might negatively impact property values. The minutes from Fairfield Gardens HOA meetings revealed a pattern of complaints Patricia had filed against residents with non-European surnames. Garden gnomes were acceptable. Buddha statues were not. American flags were encouraged. Prayer flags were prohibited. Wind chimes were specifically banned in 2018. Estates.David cross-referenced the timeline with his own move to the neighborhood. He'd bought his house in late 2019, just weeks after Patricia had been elected HOA president. His first interaction with her had been at a welcome meeting where she'd made point of asking about his cultural decorating preferences and reminding him that Willowbrook Estates maintained certain aesthetic standards. The pieces were falling into place, waiting for him to display anything that deviated from her narrow definition of acceptable American suburbia. The wind chimes weren't just a noise issue. Patricia had written several letters to the editor about maintaining neighborhood character and protecting against inappropriate foreign influences, arguing that it would change the demographic makeup of our community in ways that could negatively impact property values. The pattern was clear, but proving discriminatory intent would be difficult. Patricia was too smart to explicitly state her prejudices. Residents who didn't fit her vision of suburban conformity, but David had an advantage Patricia didn't know about. His acoustic engineering firm had recently completed a major project for the city of Los Angeles, sound levels with legal precision. That evening, David set up his equipment in his backyard. The results were exactly what he'd expected. His wind chimes generated an average of 32 decibels of sound roughly equivalent to a whisper. The city's noise ordinance prohibited sounds above 55 decibels during daytime hours. Fountain, which David also measured, produced a steady 48 decibels. The HOA's own guidelines stated that decorative items should not produce excessive noise that disrupts the peaceful enjoyment of neighboring properties. By any objective standard, David's wind chimes were not excessive. They were barely audible beyond his own property line. But Patricia wasn't interested in objective standards. She was interested in control, in the power to decide who belonged in her vision of suburban America and who didn't. She'd used her position to wage a personal campaign against David. Legal documents, his would be addressed to every resident in Willowbrook Estates to learn the truth about their HOA president, and David was just getting started. The emergency HOA meeting was scheduled for 7 p.m. on Saturday. Patricia had sent out a community-wide notice framing the meeting as a necessary step to protect the interests of law-abiding residents. David arrived early, carrying a briefcase filled with documents and a small device that looked like a smartphone but was actually a precision sound meter, chronological packets that would be impossible to dismiss or ignore. The community center filled slowly. David recognized most faces neighbors he'd waved to for years, expressions ranging from uncomfortable to openly hostile. Patricia entered at exactly 7 p.m., flanked by her usual board members and carrying a thick folder of official-looking documents. She wore a navy blazer and a smile that didn't reach her eyes, projecting the authority of someone who'd never been seriously challenged. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice carrying the practiced cadence of someone accustomed to being heard. "We have some serious matters to discuss tonight regarding community. Mr. Chen has been given multiple opportunities to comply with our reasonable requests regarding. Instead, he's chosen to harass board members and spread false accusations about discriminatory enforcement." Felt the familiar weight of being singled out, the subtle shift in the room's energy as neighbors turned to look at him. Some faces showed curiosity, others disappointment, a few outright anger. Remind everyone that the HOA exists to protect all of our property values and maintain the quality of life that makes Willowbrook Estates such a desirable place to live. When one person decides the rules don't apply to them, it affects everyone. She opened her folder and began reading from a prepared statement about noise violations. Her language was precise, professional, designed to make David's position seem unreasonable and his resistance childish. But David had been watching the room carefully. Troubled, he'd seen the Hendersons whispering to each other, their faces showing confusion rather than anger. Most tellingly, he'd observed several residents checking their own phones, likely reading the detailed email he'd sent to the entire neighborhood earlier that morning. When Patricia finished her statement, she looked directly at David for the first time. "Mr. Chen, you have 5 minutes to explain why you think you should be exempt from the rules that everyone else follows." David stood, his briefcase in hand. "But I'm not here to ask for an exemption. I'm here to show everyone what the rules actually say and how they've been applied selectively to target specific residents. Not the summaries Patricia sends out, but the original documents you signed when you bought your homes." A few hands went up hesitantly. "I have copies here for anyone who wants them. Produced less sound than most of your refrigerators, are fully compliant with every noise regulation in our community guidelines." David pulled out his sound meter and held it up. "This is a professional-grade acoustic measurement device, the same type used by city inspectors to enforce noise ordinances. Would anyone like to see the actual sound levels we're talking about?" He could see Patricia's composure beginning to crack. But David wasn't finished. He had one more revelation that would change everything. "There's something else you all need to know," he said, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Patricia doesn't just have a history of discriminatory enforcement. She has a financial incentive to drive certain residents out of the neighborhood." He pulled out a final document. Patricia Whitmore is a licensed real estate agent. She's been working with a property development company that specializes in purchasing homes in demographically transitioning neighborhoods at below-market prices. The room fell silent again. Every family she's forced to sell has been contacted by the same development company within weeks of their departure. The same company that's been quietly acquiring properties throughout Willowbrook Estates for the past 3 years. Patricia's face was no longer just white-hit, was gray with shock. Her secret was out, and there was no way to explain it away. "This isn't just discrimination," David concluded. "It's a conspiracy to manipulate property values and force residents to sell their homes at artificially low prices." Patricia Whitmore has been using her position as HOA president to financially benefit from the harassment of her neighbors. The meeting devolved into chaos as residents demanded Patricia's immediate resignation. But David knew the real reckoning was just beginning. The community would never be the same, and Patricia's house was about to become very, very noisy. The emergency vote was unanimous. Patricia Whitmore was removed from her position as HOA president, effective immediately. The board meeting that followed was equally decisive. All of Patricia's enforcement actions against David and other targeted residents were officially rescinded. And a new committee was formed to review discriminatory practices and implement fair enforcement policies. But David's victory in the community center was only the beginning. As he drove home that night, his grandmother's wind chimes still hanging silent on his porch, he began planning the next phase of his response. Patricia had cost him months of stress, humiliation, and legal fees. She'd stolen his grandmother's final gift and used it as a weapon against him. The official sanctions were satisfying, but they weren't enough. David Chen was an acoustic engineer with access to industrial-grade sound equipment and a comprehensive understanding of noise ordinances. He was also a man who'd been pushed to far by someone who'd mistaken his quiet demeanor for weaknesses. Over the next several days, David conducted a detailed acoustic survey of the entire neighborhood. Using professional-grade equipment, he mapped sound propagation patterns, identified natural resonance points, and calculated optimal placement coordinates for maximum impact. His target was specific. Patricia's house, at 52 Maple Lane, positioned perfectly between 2 vacant lots that the HOA had designated as community green space. The city's noise ordinances were comprehensive but predictable. Sounds below 55 decibels during daytime hours were automatically legal. Construction activities were permitted between 7 a.m. and 6 p.m. on weekdays, 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. on weekends. Musical instruments and mechanical devices were allowed as long as they didn't exceed specified volume levels for extended periods. David's plan was elegant in its simplicity. He would install 2 large-scale acoustic art installations on the community green spaces adjacent to Patricia's property. The installations would be beautiful, functional, and completely legal. They would also make Patricia's life a living hell. The first installation would be a community harmony bell tower, a 15-foot structure featuring 4 bronze bells of different sizes, designed to ring in response to natural wind patterns. David calculated the exact frequencies that would create the most dissonance when heard from Patricia's house. Tuning the bells to produce a combination of tones that would be barely noticeable to other residents, but would create a constant low-level anxiety response for anyone living directly between them. The second installation would be a neighborhood wind symphony, an array of precisely tuned wind chimes and resonating tubes that would create complex harmonic patterns when activated by air movement. This installation would be positioned to take advantage of the natural wind channels created by the neighborhood's tree lines and building arrangements, ensuring maximum activation during the early morning and evening hours when Patricia would be trying to sleep. Both installations would be presented to the community as artistic tributes to neighborhood harmony and cultural diversity. They would include educational plaques explaining the acoustic principles behind their design and the cultural significance of bells and wind chimes in various traditions. The installations would be beautiful, meaningful, and completely within legal parameters. They would also be precisely calibrated to make Patricia's house the most acoustically uncomfortable place in Willowbrook Estates. David spent 2 weeks refining his calculations, consulting with his team of acoustic engineers to ensure the installations would perform exactly as intended. He researched the permitting process, identified the legal requirements for community art installations, and prepared detailed proposals for the new HOA board. The engineering was complex, but David's expertise allowed him to create something that would appear random and natural to casual observers, while being precisely controlled down to the frequency and amplitude of every sound. The installations would respond to environmental conditions in ways that seemed organic, but were actually the result of careful mathematical modeling. Patricia would wake up every morning to a symphony of dissonance. She'd come home every evening, 2 harmonic patterns designed to create subconscious stress. The sounds would be constant but subtle, legal but maddening, beautiful to everyone except the person who'd stolen his grandmother's wind chimes. But David's plan went beyond simple revenge. He was creating a permanent reminder of the consequences of discriminatory abuse of power. The installations would stand as monuments to the importance of treating all community members with respect and fairness. They would serve as artistic representations of the diversity and harmony that Patricia had tried to destroy. And every time Patricia looked out her window, she would see the direct result of her actions. The bells and chimes would ring with perfect acoustic precision, a constant reminder that her attempt to silence others had only amplified their voices. The community would love them, the city would approve them, and Patricia Whitmore would discover that some fights are better left unfought. The permit applications were submitted on a Tuesday morning, accompanied by detailed architectural drawings, acoustic impact assessments, and a comprehensive community benefit analysis. David had learned from Patricia's playbook bureaucratic precision, official language, and documentation that would be impossible to challenge on technical grounds. The Community Harmony Bell Tower was described as a cultural art installation designed to celebrate the diverse heritage of Willowbrook Estates residents. The proposal included historical context about the role of bells in community gathering, spiritual practice, and cultural expression across different traditions. The tower would be constructed from sustainable materials and would require minimal maintenance while providing decades of aesthetic and cultural value. The neighborhood wind symphony was presented as an environmental art piece that would demonstrate acoustic principles while creating a dynamic soundscape that responded to natural conditions. The proposal emphasized the installation's educational value, its role in promoting community appreciation for both art and science, and its contribution to the neighborhood's cultural identity. Both proposals were endorsed by the new HOA board, which was eager to demonstrate their commitment to inclusive community development. The applications were supported by letters from neighbors who'd been impressed by David's presentation at the emergency meeting and wanted to show their support. For positive change in the community, the city's planning department approved both installations within 2 weeks. The acoustic impact assessments showed that all sounds would remain within legal limits. The artistic designs were deemed aesthetically appropriate for residential areas, and the community benefit analysis demonstrated clear value for neighborhood residents. Construction began on a Monday morning at exactly 7 a.m. David had hired a team of specialists who understood both the technical requirements and the symbolic importance of the project. The installation process was documented thoroughly, with time-lapse photography capturing the transformation of the 2 vacant lots into spaces of acoustic artistry. The bell tower took shape first, its elegant bronze framework rising from a foundation of natural stone that blended seamlessly with the neighborhood's landscape architecture. The 4 bells were installed with precision instruments that ensured perfect acoustic calibration. Their frequencies calculated to create the exact harmonic relationships David had designed. The Wind Symphony installation was more complex, requiring careful positioning of dozens of resonating elements across a 30-foot area. Each component was tuned to specific frequencies and positioned to interact with the others in ways that would create constantly shifting patterns of sound. The visual design was striking sleek metal tubes and curved surfaces that caught the light and created dynamic shadows throughout the day. Patricia watched the construction from her living room window, her expression growing more strained with each passing day. She'd tried to challenge the permits, filing complaints with the city about inappropriate noise installations and targeted harassment. But David's documentation was thorough, his legal compliance was perfect, and the community support was overwhelming. The first test activation occurred on a Thursday evening, just as David had planned. The natural wind patterns that he'd studied for weeks created the exact acoustic conditions he'd designed for the bell tower. Resonated with deep harmonious tones that carried beautifully through the neighborhood, creating a sense of peace and tranquility for everyone except Patricia. Her house, positioned precisely between the 2 installations, the sound was different. The acoustic mathematics David had employed created a phenomenon known as beating. When similar frequencies combine to create a pulsing, dissonant effect that can be deeply unsettling, the bell's harmonious tones became anxious rhythms. The Wind Symphony's gentle melodies became nerve-wracking oscillations. The installations were beautiful. The community was delighted. Patricia was trapped in an acoustic nightmare of her own making, but David wasn't finished. The installations were designed to adapt to environmental conditions, creating different sound patterns based on wind direction, temperature, and humidity. Patricia would never know what to expect, never be able to predict when the sounds would be most intense or most subtle. The system was also designed to be most active during the early morning and evening hours times. When Patricia would be trying to sleep or relax, the acoustic patterns would create a constant low-level stress response, making it impossible for her to find peace in her own home. David tested the installations carefully over the following weeks, fine-tuning the resonance patterns and adjusting the sensitivity to environmental conditions. The result was a masterpiece of acoustic engineering that appeared natural and random while being precisely controlled to achieve maximum impact on its intended target. Patricia's house had become the epicenter of an acoustic art installation that would remind her every day of the consequences of her actions. The bells rang with perfect precision, the Wind Symphony played its calculated melodies, and the entire neighborhood celebrated the beautiful additions to their community. Everyone except Patricia, who was discovering that sometimes the most effective revenge is the kind that's too beautiful to complain about. 3 weeks after the installations went live, Patricia filed her first formal complaint with the city. The document was a masterpiece of frustrated bureaucratic language, describing the constant noise, harassment, and targeted acoustic assault that she claimed was making her life unbearable. The city's response was swift and professional. A certified sound engineer arrived on a Tuesday morning to conduct official noise level measurements. David watched from his porch as the inspector set up equipment in Patricia's backyard, documented ambient sound levels, and spent 2 hours taking readings from various positions around her property. The results were exactly what David had engineered, 52 decibels maximum, well within legal limits. The inspector's report noted that the installations created pleasant ambient sounds, consistent with environmental art installations, and found no violations of any noise ordinances. Patricia's second complaint, filed a week later, claimed that the installations were causing targeted harassment and intentional infliction of emotional distress. This complaint was forwarded to the HOA's legal counsel, who reviewed the documentation and determined that the people installations were properly permitted. Community art projects that couldn't be classified as harassment, but David could see the psychological toll his acoustic design was taking. Patricia's perfectly maintained yard began showing signs of neglect. Her morning routine became erratic. Some days, she'd emerge from her house at dawn, looking exhausted and agitated. Other days, she wouldn't appear until afternoon. She'd installed soundproofing materials on her windows, But the low-frequency resonance patterns David had designed were specifically chosen to penetrate standard residential construction. The genius of David's system was its unpredictability. The installations responded to natural environmental conditions, creating different acoustic patterns based on wind speed, direction, and atmospheric pressure. Patricia could never predict when the sounds would be most intense or most subtle, making it impossible for her to develop coping strategies or find periods of reliable peace. Some mornings, the bells would ring with gentle tones that other residents found soothing. From Patricia's house, the same sounds created dissonant beating patterns that made relaxation impossible. Some evenings, the wind symphony would create beautiful harmonic progressions that enhanced the neighborhood's peaceful atmosphere. From Patricia's position between the installations, those same progressions became anxiety-inducing oscillations that made sleep nearly impossible. David had studied the psychological effects of acoustic interference for years, understanding how specific frequency combinations could create stress responses without being consciously recognized as noise. The installations operated like a sophisticated form of psychological warfare, using the principles of acoustic science to create targeted discomfort that appeared completely accidental. Patricia's behavior became increasingly erratic. She started leaving her house at odd hours, driving around the neighborhood, and returning at random times as if trying to find a pattern in the acoustic assault. She installed heavy curtains, then replaced them with blackout shades, then added weather stripping around her doors and windows. Nothing helped. The sounds weren't blocked by physical barriers. They were engineered to penetrate residential construction and create resonance within enclosed spaces. The most insidious aspect of David's design was its plausible deniability. When Patricia complained to neighbors about the constant noise, they looked at her with genuine confusion. The installations were beautiful, the sounds were pleasant, and the overall effect enhanced the neighborhood's character. Patricia's distress appeared to be an overreaction to harmless community art projects. Sarah Martinez encountered Patricia at the grocery store one Thursday afternoon and later described the interaction to David. She looked exhausted, like she hadn't slept in days. She kept asking me if I heard the bells at night, if the wind chimes were keeping me awake. When I told her I found them soothing, she just stared at me like I was lying. Patricia's isolation was becoming complete. Her complaints to city officials were dismissed as harassment of legitimate community projects. Her attempts to rally neighborhood support were met with confusion and mild irritation. The other residents couldn't understand why she was so upset about installations that everyone else found delightful. David monitored Patricia's deterioration with scientific precision. He'd installed discrete sensors that tracked the installation's performance, measuring wind conditions, acoustic output, and frequency patterns. The data confirmed that his system was performing exactly as designed, creating maximum discomfort for Patricia while remaining pleasant for everyone else. The psychological impact went beyond simple noise irritation Patricia was experiencing, what David recognized as learned helplessness, the condition that develops when someone realizes they have no control over their environment. Every attempt she made to address the problem failed, reinforcing her sense of powerlessness and increasing her stress response. But David's plan had a deeper purpose than mere revenge. He was demonstrating the same sense of helplessness that Patricia had inflicted on him and other residents through her discriminatory enforcement. She was experiencing the frustration of being trapped by a system that appeared fair on the surface, but was designed to target her specifically. The installations had become a mirror, reflecting Patricia's own methods back at her with mathematical precision. She was learning what it felt like to be singled out, harassed, and isolated by someone with the power to make her life miserable while maintaining complete legal protection. And David was just getting started. By the 6th week, Patricia's complaints had escalated to threatening legal action against the city, the HOA, and David personally. Her lawyer's letters grew increasingly desperate, claiming violations of harassment laws, nuisance ordinances, and even civil rights protections. Each letter was met with the same response. The installations were legal, properly permitted, and supported by the community. David received copies of all correspondence through the HOA's legal counsel. Patricia's attorney was clearly struggling to build a case against installations that met every legal requirement while creating effects that were impossible to prove in court. How do you demonstrate that beautiful community art projects are causing targeted harassment when they affect only one person in a way that can't be objectively measured. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning in October. David was working in his home office when he heard shouting from across the street. Through his window, he could see Patricia in her front yard, screaming at the bell tower installation while swinging a baseball bat. "I know what you're doing," she yelled, her voice carrying across the neighborhood. "This is harassment. This is targeted harassment, and everyone knows it." David called 911 and watched as Patricia took several swings at the lower portion of the bell tower. The structure was built to withstand weather and minor impacts, but her attacks were creating visible damage to the artistic elements. Other neighbors had emerged from their houses, watching in shock as their former HOA president had what appeared to be a complete mental breakdown. The police arrived within minutes, followed by an ambulance. Patricia was still screaming about acoustic torture and systematic harassment when the officers approached her. David could hear fragments of her rant from across the street, claims that the installations were designed to drive her insane, and that David was using sound as a weapon. From a psychiatric perspective, Patricia's claims sounded like paranoid delusions. The officers clearly viewed her as someone experiencing a mental health crisis rather than a victim of targeted harassment. The fact that she was making these claims about community art, installations that everyone else found pleasant, only reinforced their assessment. David watched as Patricia was taken away in the ambulance, her baseball bat confiscated as evidence, her house left empty and silent. For the first time in months, she wouldn't be there to experience the evening acoustic patterns that had driven her. To the edge of sanity, the incident report would become part of the public record, documenting Patricia's unprovoked attack on community property and her incoherent claims about noise harassment. The responding officers noted that they detected no unusual sounds from the installations, and that other residents described them as peaceful and beautiful. Lawyer called David 2 days later. The conversation was brief and professional. Patricia was being held for psychological evaluation, and her family was seeking a resolution. They were willing to drop all legal claims and complaints in exchange. For David's agreement not to pursue charges for the property damage, David agreed to the settlement, but not out of mercy. Patricia's destruction of the bell tower had given him the legal justification to upgrade the installations. The insurance claim would fund improvements that would make the acoustic effects even more sophisticated. And targeted. Patricia returned to her house a week later, but only to pack. David watched from his porch as moving trucks arrived and began loading her belongings. She moved with mechanical precision, avoiding eye contact with neighbors and never looking toward the installations that had driven her. Patricia's real estate connections couldn't help her now. She was desperate to escape the acoustic nightmare she'd created for herself through her own discriminatory actions. David felt a sense of satisfaction as he watched the moving trucks disappear down Maple Lane. Justice had been served not through legal channels or official sanctions, but through the elegant application of acoustic science and mathematical precision. Patricia had learned that some people are dangerous to underestimate, and that expertise can be weaponized just as effectively as bureaucratic power. But the story wasn't over. Of discriminatory abuse of power, and David still had one final surprise for his former tormentor. The house at 52 Maple Lane remained empty for 3 months. The property sat on the market, with price reduction after price reduction, as potential buyers were somehow put off by the location between 2 artistic sound installations, the resonance patterns, and adding new elements that would activate based on motion sensors and proximity detection. The installations had evolved into sophisticated acoustic sculptures that could respond to environmental conditions with almost musicians who were delighted by the unique acoustic environment. They found the sound installations inspiring and peaceful, describing the effects as living in the middle of a natural symphony. Complexity. David watched from his porch as the Johnsons moved in, their children playing in the yard while the bells chimed gently overhead. The installations had achieved their purpose, removing a toxic influence from the community while creating something genuinely beautiful for everyone else. The Willowbrook Estates, HOA, the new board implemented transparent enforcement policies, community involvement in decision-making, and regular reviews of all regulations to ensure fair application. David had been elected to the board, bringing his engineering expertise to infrastructure decisions and his experience with discrimination to policy discussions. The installations had become tourist attractions. Architecture students visited to study the integration of acoustic science and environmental art. City planners referenced them as examples of how communities could create meaningful public art that enhanced rather than disrupted residential areas. The neighborhood had gained a reputation as a model of inclusive community development, but David's final surprise he'd been tracking the sale of her new house through public records, and he knew she'd purchased property in a development called Cedar Ridge Estates. What Patricia didn't know was that David's acoustic engineering firm had been contracted to design sound installations for that acoustic environment that would demonstrate the latest advances in environmental sound art. The project had been approved by Cedar Ridge's Planning Commission, endorsed by their HOA, and funded by a grant from the State Arts Council. Patricia would discover that her past had followed her to her new home. The installations wouldn't target her specifically. David had learned the value of creating beauty, rather than focusing on revenge, but she would be reminded every day that her actions had consequences, and that the people she'd tried to silence had found ways to make their voices heard. David received a text message from an unknown number. 6 months later, you won. I understand now what I did to you and others. I'm sorry, he never responded. The message was acknowledgement enough. The wind chimes his grandmother had given him still hung on his porch. Joined now by a small collection of similar instruments from neighbors who'd been inspired by his story, they created a gentle, random melody that blended with the larger installations, a personal soundtrack to his victory over discrimination and abuse of power. David had learned that the most effective response to systematic oppression wasn't anger or confrontation, but expertise applied with precision and patience. He'd transformed his neighborhood, protected future residents from discriminatory treatment, and created something beautiful in the process. The bells continued to ring, the wind symphony continued to play, and Willowbrook Estates continued to thrive as a community where everyone belonged. Patricia's house had indeed sat between two giant bells, just as David had promised. But more importantly, the community had learned to listen to voices that had been silenced for too long. Justice, it turned out, could be both beautiful and precise, and sometimes the most powerful response to hatred was the creation of something that made the world a little more harmonious for everyone else. David sat on his porch that evening, listening to the gentle chimes his grandmother had given him, surrounded by the larger symphony he'd created. The sounds blended together in perfect harmony, had found its voice, and it was singing